In this video, we will explore the most bizarre, defiant, and cryptic final words ever spoken by death row inmates in United States history. From pop culture references to rambling speeches about extraterrestrial visitors, these last statements reveal the final thoughts of condemned prisoners facing their ultimate punishment. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss a video. And let's get into it. Aileen Carol Wuornos, State of Florida. On December 1st, 1989, 33-year-old Aileen Wuornos began what would become one of the most notorious killing sprees in American criminal history. Working as a prostitute along Florida's highways, Wuornos would encounter men who picked her up, then rob and murder them with a .22 caliber revolver. Her first victim was 51-year-old Richard Mallory, whose body was discovered on December 13th, 1989, near Daytona Beach. Over the next 11 months, Wuornos would kill 6 more men. David Spears, 47, shot 6 times. Charles Carskadden, 40, shot 9 times. Troy Burris, 50. Charles Dick Humphreys, 56, shot 7 times. And Walter Gino Antonio, 61, shot 4 times. The body of 65-year-old Peter Seams was never found, though his abandoned car was recovered. Police arrested Wuornos on January 9, 1991, at the Last Resort Bar in Port Orange, Florida. A week later, she confessed to the murders during recorded phone calls with her former lover, Tyria Moore, who had agreed to cooperate with investigators. Her trial for Richard Mallory's murder began on January 14, 1992, and lasted just 2 weeks. Despite her claims of self-defense, the jury convicted Wuornos of first-degree murder on January 27th. 4 days later, she received the death sentence. Over the following year, she pleaded no contest or guilty to 5 additional murders, receiving 5 more death sentences. Wuornos spent nearly 11 years on death row at Broward Correctional Institution. Diagnosed with borderline and antisocial personality disorders, she became increasingly erratic, giving bizarre interviews to documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield and repeatedly expressing her desire to end her appeals and be executed. In April 2002, the Florida Supreme Court granted her request to waive further appeals after finding her competent to make that decision. For her last meal, Wuornos declined the traditional special meal, requesting only a cup of coffee. She had refused barbecued chicken the night before her execution. On October 9, 2002, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Starkey. She was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. When asked for her final words, the woman who had terrorized Florida's highways for nearly a year delivered one of the most bizarre final statements in execution history. "I'm sailing with The Rock," she said, apparently referencing either Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or some spiritual interpretation. "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." Aileen Wuornos was 46 years old at the time of her execution. Thomas J. Grasso, State of Oklahoma. On Christmas Eve, 1990, 26-year-old Thomas Grasso was desperate for money to buy drugs. His addiction had driven him to break into the Tulsa home of 87-year-old Hilda Johnson, an elderly widow who lived alone. When Johnson discovered Grasso ransacking her belongings, he strangled her with the cord from her Christmas tree lights, then continued searching for valuables. He stole a television, radio, and small amount of cash before fleeing. Johnson's body was discovered by relatives who came to check on her. Just 10 days later, on January 3, 1991, Grasso traveled to New York, where he broke into the Staten Island home of 81-year-old Leslie Holtz. When Holtz surprised him during the burglary, Grasso beat the elderly man with a candlestick, then strangled him. He made off with approximately $100 in cash and some jewelry. Police connected Grasso to both murders through fingerprints and witness testimony. He was arrested in New York, but extradited to Oklahoma, where he faced the death penalty for Johnson's murder. His trial lasted 3 weeks, with defense attorneys arguing that his severe drug addiction and troubled childhood should spare him from execution. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before finding Grasso guilty of first-degree murder. They recommended death, citing the especially heinous nature of the crime committed during the Christmas season against a helpless elderly victim. Grasso spent nearly 5 years on death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Despite multiple appeals challenging his conviction and sentence, the courts upheld his death sentence. He became increasingly focused on food during his final days, obsessing over what would be his last meal. For his final meal, Grasso requested an elaborate feast: 2 dozen steamed mussels, 2 dozen steamed clams, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, a half-dozen barbecued spare ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, 1/2 of a pumpkin pie, and spaghetti with clam sauce. Prison officials fulfilled most of his requests, though some items had to be substituted. On March 20th, 1995, Thomas Grasso was executed by lethal injection at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m. When asked for his final statement, Grasso delivered what many consider one of the most trivial and absurd final words ever recorded on death row. "I did not get my SpaghettiOs," he complained. "I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." His final words focused entirely on the prison's failure to provide the exact brand of canned pasta he had requested, ignoring his victims and their families. Thomas Grasso was 32 years old at the time of his execution. James French, State of Oklahoma. On August 12, 1958, 26-year-old James French was serving a life sentence at Oklahoma State Penitentiary for murdering a motorist during a robbery. French had adjusted poorly to prison life and became increasingly despondent about spending the rest of his life behind bars. That day, French approached a fellow inmate named Eddie Shelton in the prison's laundry facility. Without warning or apparent provocation, French picked up a large piece of metal equipment and bludgeoned Shelton to death. Prison guards found French standing over the body, making no attempt to flee or hide his crime. When questioned by prison officials, French openly admitted to the murder. He told investigators that he had killed Shelton deliberately because he knew it would result in the death penalty. French explained that he was unwilling to spend the rest of his life in prison and saw execution as his only way out. He had essentially committed murder to commit suicide by state. French's trial for Shelton's murder was straightforward, as he offered no defense and openly confessed to the killing. The prosecution had little difficulty proving premeditation, given French's own statements about his motive. The jury quickly convicted him of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. During his time on death row, French maintained that he had no regrets about his actions. He told prison counselors and chaplains that he preferred death to life imprisonment. He showed no remorse for killing Shelton, viewing him merely as a means to an end. French made no special requests for his last meal, accepting whatever the prison kitchen prepared for condemned inmates. On August 10, 1966, James French was executed in Oklahoma's electric chair at McAlester State Penitentiary. As prison officials strapped him into the chair and prepared to carry out the execution, French was asked if he had any final words. With dark humor befitting someone who had orchestrated his own execution, French replied, "How's this for your headline? French fries." His wordplay on his own surname and the method of his execution became one of the most memorable final statements in death row history. James French was 34 years old at the time of his execution, having successfully achieved his goal of avoiding life imprisonment through his own calculated murder. Gary Graham, State of Texas. On May 13, 1981, 17-year-old Gary Graham was accused of shooting 53-year-old Bobby Lambert during a robbery in a Houston parking lot. Graham, who later changed his name to Shaka Sankofa while on death row, would become one of the most controversial figures in modern death penalty history. The case against Graham relied entirely on the testimony of a single eyewitness, Bernadine Skillern, who claimed she saw the shooting from about 30 feet away through her car windshield at night. No physical evidence linked Graham to Lambert's murder. The gun was never found, no fingerprints were recovered, and two other witnesses who were closer to the scene could not identify Graham as the shooter. Graham admitted to committing several robberies that week while high on drugs, but steadfastly maintained his innocence in Lambert's killing. He claimed he was with a girlfriend at the time of the murder, but his court-appointed attorney failed to call her as an alibi witness during the trial. The trial lasted only 2 days. Graham's defense attorney, who was later disbarred for inadequate representation in other cases, presented virtually no defense. The all-white jury, which included no black members, deliberated for 3 hours before sentencing Graham to death. His case became an international cause, with supporters arguing he was being executed based on flimsy evidence tainted by racial bias. Protesters, including Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and Bianca Jagger, demanded clemency. The controversy intensified when it was revealed that Graham had been just 17 at the time of the alleged crime. Graham spent 19 years on death row, using his time to educate himself and become a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform. He earned his GED, studied law, and wrote extensively about his case and the death penalty system. For his last meal, Graham requested fried chicken, French fries, and orange juice. On June 22, 2000, Shaka Sankofa was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit amid massive protests outside the prison. When asked for his final statement, he delivered a defiant political manifesto that reflected his transformation from street criminal to activist. "I die fighting for what I believe in," he declared. "I am an innocent man. They are murdering me tonight. Keep marching, black people. They are killing me tonight because of my politics. I want you to continue with my struggle. You must continue to destroy capitalism and imperialism. Black power." His final words became a rallying cry for death penalty opponents and civil rights activists. Graham was 36 years old at the time of his execution. Carl Panzram, State of Kansas. On June 15, 1928, 36-year-old Carl Panzram was serving time at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary when he committed the murder that would send him to the gallows. Panzram, already a career criminal with a long history of violence, had been assigned to work in the prison laundry. That day, Panzram got into an argument with Robert Warnke, the civilian laundry foreman. Without warning, Panzram picked up a heavy iron bar and bludgeoned Warnke to death in front of multiple witnesses. Prison guards found Panzram standing over the body, showing no remorse for his actions. This murder was just the latest in a lifetime of violence for Panzram, who had confessed to killing at least 21 people and committing thousands of other crimes, including rape, arson, and robbery across multiple countries. He claimed to have no conscience and took pride in causing suffering to others. Panzram's trial for Warnke's murder was brief, as he offered no defense and seemed eager to be executed. He told the court that he had no regrets and would kill again if given the opportunity. The jury quickly convicted him and recommended death. During his time on death row, Panzram maintained his defiant attitude toward society and the justice system. He corresponded with prison reform advocate Henry Lesser, providing detailed confessions of his crimes while expressing his hatred for humanity. He actively opposed any attempts to commute his sentence, insisting that he wanted to die. Panzram made no special requests for his last meal, eating whatever the prison provided. On September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was hanged at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. As prison officials prepared the noose, they asked if he had any final words. True to his lifelong contempt for authority and society, Panzram delivered one of the most hostile final statements ever recorded. "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard," he snarled at the executioner. "I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Even facing death, Panzram remained unrepentant and aggressive to the end. He was 38 years old at the time of his execution. Johnny Frank Garrett, State of Texas. On Halloween night, 1981, 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett was accused of one of the most shocking crimes in Texas history: the rape and murder of 76-year-old Sister Tadea Benz at St. Francis Convent in Amarillo. Sister Tadea worked in the convent kitchen and tended the grounds. On that October 31st evening, someone broke into her room, sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and beat her so severely that blood was found on the walls and ceiling. The brutality of the crime against an elderly nun horrified the community. Garrett lived at a halfway house near the convent and had a documented history of mental illness, sexual abuse, and substance abuse dating back to early childhood. He had an IQ of 62 and suffered from chronic psychosis and brain damage. Police arrested him after finding his fingerprints at the crime scene. During interrogation, Garrett initially denied involvement, but later signed a confession. However, he quickly recanted, claiming police had coerced the confession through threats and abuse. His case raised serious questions about his mental competency and ability to understand the charges against him. At trial, Garrett's attorneys presented extensive evidence of his severe mental impairments and horrific childhood abuse. Multiple family members had sexually abused him, starting at age 2, and he had been forced to perform sexual acts for adult entertainment. Despite these mitigating factors, the jury convicted Garrett and sentenced him to death. His case drew international condemnation from human rights groups and the Vatican, who argued that executing someone so mentally impaired violated basic human dignity. Appeals focused on his intellectual disability and the questionable evidence against him. For his last meal, Garrett made a poignant request that reflected his connection to the victim: chocolate ice cream, the same treat Sister Tadea used to give him when he did odd jobs at the convent. On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit. When asked for his final words, the young man, whose life had been marked by abuse and mental illness, delivered a statement that mixed gratitude with profanity. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me," he said quietly. "The rest of the world can kiss my ass." Years after his execution, evidence emerged suggesting Garrett may have been innocent. Another man who lived near the convent confessed on his deathbed to killing Sister Tadea, and DNA evidence has called Garrett's guilt into serious question. He was 28 years old at the time of his execution. Robert Alton Harris, State of California. On July 15, 1978, 25-year-old Robert Harris and his younger brother Daniel decided to rob a bank in San Diego. Their plan required a getaway car, which led them to target 2 teenage boys who had stopped at a fast food restaurant. Harris approached 16-year-old John Majewski and 15-year-old Michael Baker as they sat eating lunch in Majewski's car. Claiming to be undercover police officers, the Harris brothers forced the teenagers to drive them to a remote area. Once there, Harris ordered the boys out of the car and shot them both multiple times with a Luger pistol. After killing the teenagers, Harris and his brother drove the stolen car to the bank, but their robbery attempt failed when they found the bank had already closed. The senseless murders had been committed for nothing. Harris then callously finished eating the hamburgers that his young victims had been enjoying before he killed them. Police arrested both Harris brothers within days. During questioning, Robert Harris showed no remorse for the murders, even laughing as he described killing the teenagers. His behavior shocked investigators and would later influence the jury's decision to recommend death. Harris's trial lasted several weeks, with defense attorneys arguing that his troubled childhood and history of abuse should spare him from execution. They presented evidence that Harris had been severely beaten by his father and had suffered brain damage from repeated head injuries. The prosecution countered that Harris was a cold-blooded killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. The jury convicted Harris of first-degree murder and recommended death. His case became historically significant because California had not executed anyone since 1967, making Harris potentially the first person to face the state's restored death penalty. Harris spent 13 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. His execution was delayed multiple times by legal challenges and appeals, making it one of the most closely watched cases in California history. Media attention intensified as his execution date approached. For his last meal, Harris requested a 21-piece bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, 2 large Domino's pizzas, ice cream, a bag of jelly beans, a 6-pack of Pepsi, and a pack of Camel cigarettes. On April 21, 1992, Robert Alton Harris was executed in California's gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 a.m., becoming the first person executed in California in 25 years. When asked for his final statement, Harris addressed the families of his victims with words that many found inadequate given the brutality of his crimes. "You can be assured that I will pay the price for what I have done," he said calmly. "And you can be assured that 4 others will pay the price for what they have done to me and my family." His cryptic reference to 4 others was never explained, leaving observers to speculate about who he blamed for his situation. Robert Alton Harris was 39 years old at the time of his execution. Charlie Brooks, Jr., State of Texas. On December 14, 1976, 23-year-old Charlie Brooks, Jr. and his partner Woody Loudres attempted to kidnap David Gregory, a used car salesman in Fort Worth, Texas. Their plan was to hold Gregory for ransom, but the scheme quickly turned deadly. Brooks and Loudres forced Gregory into the trunk of his own car at gunpoint, then drove to a remote motel where they demanded he call his business partner and arrange for $40,000 in ransom money. When Gregory's partner refused to pay and threatened to call police, Brooks became enraged. The kidnappers drove Gregory to a secluded area near Benbrook Lake. There, Brooks shot the car salesman once in the head with a .45 caliber pistol, killing him instantly. They dumped his body and abandoned the car, but were arrested within days after witnesses identified them. Both men were tried for capital murder, but only Brooks received the death sentence. Loudres, who was white, received a life sentence after testifying that Brooks, who was black, had been the triggerman. This disparity raised questions about racial bias in the application of the death penalty. Brooks's trial lasted 2 weeks, with his attorneys arguing that he had not intended to kill Gregory and that the crime was the result of poor planning rather than premeditated murder. The prosecution successfully convinced the jury that Brooks was dangerous and likely to kill again if not executed. Brooks spent nearly 6 years on death row at Ellis Unit near Huntsville. His case gained national attention because he would be the first person executed by lethal injection, a new method that Texas had recently adopted as more humane than the electric chair. For his last meal, Brooks requested T-bone steak, French fries, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, biscuits, and peach cobbler. On December 7, 1982, Charlie Brooks, Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit, making history as the first person in the world to be executed using this method. He was pronounced dead at 12:16 a.m. When prison officials asked for his final words, Brooks delivered a statement that combined religious themes with bizarre imagery. "I, at this very moment, have absolutely no fear of what may happen to this body," he declared. "But I do have hope, as I hope that one day we can do away with ourselves. I love you all. Be careful driving on the slippery roads." His reference to slippery roads puzzled witnesses, as it was neither raining nor snowing that day. Charlie Brooks, Jr. was 31 years old at the time of his execution. Pedro Medina, State of Florida. On April 3, 1982, 23-year-old Pedro Medina broke into the Orlando home of Dorothy James, a 52-year-old elementary school teacher who lived alone. Medina, an undocumented immigrant from Cuba, had been in the United States for less than 2 years. When James discovered Medina burglarizing her home, he attacked her with a kitchen knife, stabbing her multiple times in the chest and neck. The teacher died from her wounds, and Medina fled with jewelry and cash worth less than $200. Her body was discovered the next day by concerned colleagues when she failed to show up for work. Police arrested Medina after matching his fingerprints to evidence found at the crime scene. During questioning, he confessed to the burglary, but claimed he had not intended to kill James. He said he panicked when she surprised him and grabbed the knife in self-defense. Medina's trial lasted 3 weeks, complicated by language barriers and cultural differences. His court-appointed attorney struggled to communicate with him effectively, and interpreters were not always available during crucial proceedings. The prosecution portrayed Medina as a dangerous criminal who had come to America only to prey on innocent victims. The jury convicted Medina of first-degree murder and recommended death. His appeals focused on claims of inadequate legal representation and cultural bias in his trial, but Florida courts upheld his conviction and sentence. Medina spent 15 years on death row at Florida State Prison. He maintained his innocence throughout his appeals, claiming that racism and anti-immigrant sentiment had prevented him from receiving a fair trial. His case attracted attention from immigrant rights groups and opponents of the death penalty. For his last meal, Medina requested Cuban coffee, Cuban toast, and a single banana. On March 25, 1997, Pedro Medina was executed in Florida's electric chair at Florida State Prison. The execution became notorious when flames shot from Medina's head mask during the electrocution, creating a spectacle that horrified witnesses and renewed debates about the humanness of the electric chair. When asked for his final statement, Medina spoke in both Spanish and English, delivering words that reflected his continued claims of innocence. "I am still innocent," he said firmly in English, then switched to Spanish. "Yo soy inocente. Que Dios los perdone porque ellos no saben lo que hacen." Translated, his Spanish words meant, "I am innocent. May God forgive them because they don't know what they do." Pedro Medina was 39 years old at the time of his execution, which became a catalyst for Florida's eventual switch from the electric chair to lethal injection. Jesse Walter Bishop, State of Nevada. On December 22, 1977, 29-year-old Jesse Bishop was on parole from a California prison when he decided to rob the El Morocco Casino in Las Vegas. Bishop, a career criminal with multiple convictions for armed robbery, entered the casino shortly after midnight carrying a sawed-off shotgun. Bishop approached the casino cage and demanded money from the cashier. When casino employee David Ballard, a 22-year-old newlywed working as a security guard, attempted to intervene, Bishop turned and fired his shotgun at point-blank range. The blast killed Ballard instantly in front of horrified customers and staff. After shooting Ballard, Bishop grabbed approximately $2,500 from the cashier and fled the casino. Police arrested him less than 24 hours later at a nearby motel after witnesses provided detailed descriptions of the gunman. Bishop's trial lasted 2 weeks, with his defense attorneys arguing that he had been high on drugs and alcohol during the robbery and had not intended to kill anyone. They claimed the shooting was a panic reaction rather than premeditated murder. The prosecution countered that Bishop was a habitual criminal who had chosen to arm himself with a deadly weapon, making him responsible for the consequences. The jury convicted Bishop of first-degree murder and recommended death. Nevada had not executed anyone since 1946, making Bishop's case historically significant as the state prepared to resume capital punishment after a 30-year hiatus. Bishop spent only 9 months on death row at Nevada State Prison. Unlike many condemned inmates who file extensive appeals, Bishop actively sought his own execution. He fired his attorneys and refused to cooperate with efforts to delay his death sentence, telling reporters he preferred death to life in prison. For his last meal, Bishop requested a steak dinner with all the trimmings, but ate very little of the food when it was served. On October 22, 1979, Jesse Bishop was executed in Nevada's gas chamber at Nevada State Prison in Carson City. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 a.m., becoming the first person executed in Nevada in over 3 decades. When prison officials asked for his final words, Bishop delivered a statement that mixed defiance with resignation. "I've been a loner all my life with my family," he said quietly. "I've been a loner all my life with my friends. I've been a loner all my life in my mind. Give my love to my family and friends." His somber reflection on his isolation stood in stark contrast to many of the more dramatic final statements by other condemned prisoners. Jesse Bishop was 30 years old at the time of his execution. Stephen Timothy Judy, State of Indiana. On April 28, 1979, 23-year-old Stephen Judy was driving on Interstate 65 near Indianapolis when he spotted Terry Chastain's disabled car on the shoulder. Chastain, a 23-year-old mother, was traveling with her 3 young children, 4-year-old Misty, 2-year-old Steve, and 5-month-old Mark. Judy pulled over and offered to help, but instead of assisting the stranded family, he forced Chastain and her children into his car at gunpoint. He drove them to a remote area where he raped and strangled Chastain with his bare hands while her children watched in terror. After killing their mother, Judy threw the 3 children into White Lick Creek. 4-year-old Misty and 2-year-old Steve drowned immediately, but 5-month-old Mark survived the initial plunge. Witnesses later testified that Judy waded into the creek and held the infant underwater until he stopped breathing. Police arrested Judy the next day after witnesses reported seeing him near the crime scene. During interrogation, he confessed to the murders in chilling detail, showing no remorse for killing a mother and her 3 small children. He told investigators that he had committed the crimes because he enjoyed causing pain and suffering. Judy's trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting evidence that he had previously committed similar violent crimes against women and children. His defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill and had been severely abused as a child, but psychological evaluations found him competent to stand trial. The jury convicted Judy on 4 counts of murder and recommended death. The judge agreed, noting the particularly heinous nature of the crimes against innocent children. Judy showed no emotion when the sentence was pronounced. Judy spent 2 years on death row at Indiana State Prison. He refused most appeals and told prison officials that he wanted to be executed as soon as possible. He gave several interviews to reporters, expressing no regret for his crimes and threatening to kill again if his sentence were commuted. For his last meal, Judy requested shrimp, lobster, and a steak, but barely touched the food when it arrived. On March 9, 1981, Stephen Judy was executed in Indiana's electric chair at Indiana State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:13 a.m., becoming the first person executed in Indiana since 1961. When asked for his final words, Judy delivered one of the most chilling and unrepentant statements in death row history. "I don't hold any grudges," he said coldly. "This is my doing. I'm sorry it happened. But you're not putting a maniac to death. You're putting an animal to death." His self-description as an animal, rather than acknowledging his humanity, shocked witnesses and reinforced public support for his execution. Stephen Judy was 24 years old at the time of his execution. John Spenkelink, State of Florida. On February 3, 1973, 27-year-old John Spenkelink was traveling through Florida when he met Joseph Simankiewicz, a 45-year-old convicted felon, at a Tallahassee motel. The 2 men, both ex-convicts, decided to travel together and rented a room at the motel. According to Spenkelink's later testimony, Simankiewicz forced him at gunpoint to participate in several armed robberies over the next 2 days. Spenkelink claimed he was essentially being held captive by the older, more experienced criminal who threatened to kill him if he tried to escape. On February 5th, the situation came to a deadly conclusion in their shared motel room. Spenkelink shot Simankiewicz twice in the back of the head with a .45 caliber pistol, killing him instantly. He then fled the scene with money they had stolen during their robbery spree. Police arrested Spenkelink several days later in California. During questioning, he admitted to killing Simankiewicz, but claimed it was self-defense. He told investigators that Simankiewicz had been holding him at gunpoint and threatening to kill him, forcing him to act first in order to save his own life. Spenkelink's trial lasted several weeks, with the central issue being whether he had acted in self-defense or committed premeditated murder. His defense attorneys argued that he had been terrorized by Simankiewicz and had no choice but to kill him. The prosecution countered that the evidence showed Spenkelink had shot an unarmed man in cold blood. The jury convicted Spenkelink of first-degree murder, but recommended life imprisonment rather than death. However, the judge overruled the jury's recommendation and sentenced him to death, a practice that was legal in Florida at the time. Spenkelink spent 6 years on death row at Florida State Prison. His case became a cause for death penalty opponents, who argued that he had been wrongfully sentenced to death for what should have been considered self-defense. Despite extensive appeals and international pressure for clemency, Florida courts upheld his death sentence. For his last meal, Spenkelink requested Delmonico steak, baked potato with sour cream and butter, green salad with French dressing, sweet corn, rolls and butter, and milk. On May 25, 1979, John Spenkelink was executed in Florida's electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 10:12 a.m., becoming the first person executed in Florida since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. When prison officials asked for his final words, Spenkelink delivered a brief but pointed statement that referenced his belief in his innocence. "Capital punishment," he said firmly. "Those without the capital get the punishment." His play on words highlighted the disparity between rich and poor defendants in death penalty cases, suggesting that his lack of resources had contributed to his execution. John Spenkelink was 30 years old at the time of his execution. James Smith, State of Texas. On November 6, 1983, 27-year-old James Smith broke into the Houston home of Larry Rojas, a 29-year-old insurance agent who lived alone. Smith had been burglarizing homes in the affluent Montrose area for several weeks, targeting houses that appeared unoccupied during daytime hours. When Rojas unexpectedly returned home during the burglary, Smith panicked and attacked him with a tire iron he had brought as a burglary tool. He struck Rojas multiple times in the head, fracturing his skull and causing massive brain trauma. Rojas died from his injuries 3 days later in the hospital without regaining consciousness. Police arrested Smith after matching his fingerprints to evidence found at the scene. During questioning, he admitted to the burglary, but claimed he had not intended to hurt anyone. He said he grabbed the tire iron in panic when Rojas surprised him and struck out in fear. Smith's trial lasted 2 weeks, with his defense attorneys arguing that the killing was not premeditated murder, but rather the result of a burglary gone wrong. They emphasized that Smith had no history of violence and had never intended to hurt anyone. The prosecution countered that Smith had armed himself with a deadly weapon and was therefore responsible for the consequences of his criminal actions. The jury convicted Smith of capital murder during the commission of a burglary and recommended death. The judge accepted their recommendation, noting that Smith had chosen to break into occupied homes during daylight hours, creating a significant risk to innocent victims. Smith spent 11 years on death row at Ellis Unit near Huntsville. He underwent a religious conversion during his incarceration, becoming an ordained minister and counseling other inmates. He expressed deep remorse for his crime and corresponded regularly with Rojas's family, seeking their forgiveness. For his last meal, Smith requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, dinner rolls, and chocolate cake. On June 26, 1994, James Smith was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit. He was pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m. When prison officials asked for his final statement, Smith delivered words that seemed to reference his religious conversion, but included a puzzling metaphor. "I just want everyone to know that the prosecutor and Bill Scott are sorry sons of bitches," he said, then immediately shifted tone. "But I forgive them, as God has forgiven me. I'm ready to go fishing with Jesus." His abrupt transition from profanity to religious imagery, culminating in the bizarre reference to fishing with Jesus, exemplified the contradictory nature of many final statements. James Smith was 38 years old at the time of his execution. George Appel, State of New York. On March 25, 1928, 32-year-old George Appel was arrested for the murder of police officer William Higgins in New York City. Appel, a career criminal with multiple arrests for robbery and assault, had been attempting to rob a candy store in Brooklyn when Officer Higgins responded to reports of the crime in progress. When Higgins entered the store, Appel shot him twice with a .38 caliber revolver, killing the 28-year-old officer instantly. Appel fled the scene but was captured several blocks away after a foot chase through the neighborhood. The robbery had netted him less than $40. Appel's trial lasted 3 weeks, with his defense attorneys arguing that the shooting was not premeditated and that he had fired in panic rather than with intent to kill. They emphasized his troubled childhood and history of mental illness as mitigating factors. The prosecution portrayed him as a dangerous criminal who had deliberately chosen to arm himself and was therefore responsible for the officer's death. The jury convicted Appel of first-degree murder and recommended death. New York State was actively using the electric chair during this period, and Appel joined dozens of other condemned inmates at Sing Sing Correctional Facility awaiting execution. Appel spent 2 years on death row, during which time he became known for his dark sense of humor and philosophical conversations with prison guards and chaplains. He read extensively and wrote letters to family members, often including jokes and wordplay that seemed inappropriate given his circumstances. No record exists of Appel making any special requests for his last meal. On August 9, 1928, George Appel was executed in New York's electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. As prison officials prepared to carry out the execution, they asked if he had any final words. True to his reputation for dark humor, Appel delivered what became one of the most famous one-liners in execution history. "Well, gentlemen," he said with apparent calm, "you are about to see a baked Appel." His pun on his own surname and the method of execution demonstrated remarkable composure in the face of death. George Appel was 34 years old at the time of his execution. Ricky Ray Rector, State of Arkansas. On March 21, 1981, 27-year-old Ricky Ray Rector went to Gino's restaurant in Conway, Arkansas, where he got into an argument with the manager over being refused service. The dispute escalated when Rector, who had been drinking heavily, became increasingly belligerent and threatening. After being asked to leave the restaurant, Rector went to his car and retrieved a .38 caliber pistol. He returned to the restaurant and shot Tommy Oliver, a customer who had tried to calm the situation, killing him instantly. Rector then fled in his car, beginning a manhunt that would last several hours. When police finally cornered Rector at a friend's house, he agreed to surrender peacefully. However, as Officer Robert Martin approached to arrest him, Rector suddenly pulled out his gun and shot the officer in the neck, killing him. Immediately after shooting Martin, Rector turned the gun on himself and fired a bullet into his own head. The self-inflicted gunshot wound did not kill Rector, but caused massive brain damage that left him severely mentally impaired. He required emergency surgery to save his life, and doctors determined that the injury had destroyed much of his frontal lobe, leaving him with the mental capacity of a small child. Rector's trial raised unprecedented questions about executing someone who had become mentally disabled as a result of his own suicide attempt. His defense attorneys argued that his brain damage made him incompetent to understand the nature of his punishment. Psychological evaluations showed that Rector could not comprehend the concept of death or execution. Despite his obvious mental impairment, the jury convicted Rector of capital murder and recommended death. The case became nationally controversial when Bill Clinton, then governor of Arkansas, refused to commute the sentence despite widespread criticism from mental health experts and religious leaders. Rector spent 11 years on death row, during which his childlike behavior and inability to understand his situation became well documented. He often asked prison guards when he would be returning to his cell after his execution, not comprehending that death was permanent. For his last meal, Rector requested fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and pecan pie. Significantly, he saved the pecan pie to eat after his execution, demonstrating his complete lack of understanding about what was going to happen to him. On January 24, 1992, Ricky Ray Rector was executed by lethal injection at Arkansas's diagnostic unit. He was pronounced dead at 10:54 p.m. When prison officials asked for his final words, Rector's statement reflected his mental impairment and confusion about the proceedings. "You can tell my attorney to clear up the rest of my legal business," he said matter-of-factly. "And, I want to vote for Bill Clinton for president." His reference to clearing up legal business and voting in the upcoming election showed his complete inability to grasp that he was about to die. Rector was 38 years old at the time of his execution, which remains one of the most controversial in modern American history. These cases represent some of the most bizarre, defiant, and tragic final words ever spoken by condemned prisoners in American history. From Eileen Wuornos's science fiction references to Thomas Grasso's complaint about canned pasta, from James French's dark wordplay to Ricky Ray Rector's childlike confusion, these final statements reveal the complex psychology of individuals facing the ultimate punishment. The variety of these last words reflects the diverse backgrounds, mental states, and coping mechanisms of death row inmates. Some used humor to mask their fear, others proclaimed their innocence or expressed remorse, and still others used their final moments to deliver political messages or personal grudges. What they all shared was the knowledge that these would be the last words they would ever speak. Since many of these executions took place, significant changes have occurred in American death penalty law. The Supreme Court has banned the execution of juvenile offenders, individuals with intellectual disabilities, and those who were mentally incompetent at the time of their crimes. Several states have abolished capital punishment entirely, while others have imposed moratoriums on executions. The strange and often disturbing final words of these condemned prisoners continue to fascinate the public and provide insight into the human condition under extreme circumstances. They serve as a reminder of the gravity of the death penalty and the complex moral and legal questions surrounding its use in American society. The final words we just heard were haunting in their own way, but they weren't an isolated example. Across the history of executions, there's been a troubling overlap between capital punishment and mental illness. Some inmates facing the death chamber were already deeply unstable, raising painful questions about justice, responsibility, and humanity. To explore this unsettling reality further, let's revisit a case we've covered before, one that sheds light on how mental illness and the death penalty have collided in ways that continue to spark controversy.
Is the death penalty fair for prisoners who live with serious mental illnesses? In this video, we will explore 10 tragic cases of mentally ill inmates who were executed in the United States. We will discuss their crimes, mental struggles, final words, and last meals. Let's begin with our first case. Cecil Clayton was a man from Missouri whose life took a tragic turn after a severe brain injury in the early 1970s. In 1972, an accident caused him to lose part of his frontal lobe, leaving him with serious mental impairments, including paranoia and schizophrenia. Despite these struggles, he was eventually convicted of killing a sheriff's deputy in 1996. His case gained much attention because of the questions surrounding his sanity and whether it was morally right to sentence him to death. Prosecutors argued that Clayton knew exactly what he was doing, pointing to his actions before and after the shooting as proof of his awareness. Defense attorneys, however, insisted that his mental damage meant he could not fully grasp the consequences of his behavior. Missouri courts decided that he was competent enough to face the death penalty. This ruling angered many who believed that executing a man with such significant mental deficits was cruel and undermined the principles of justice. In the weeks leading up to his execution, activists and mental health advocates voiced serious concerns. They suggested that the legal system must be more flexible when dealing with inmates who have severe brain injuries or other psychiatric conditions. Nonetheless, the appeals did not change the outcome. On the 17th day of March, 2015, the state carried out his execution by lethal injection. During his final moments, Cecil Clayton said, "They brought me up here to execute me," a statement reflecting his apparent confusion and acceptance of his fate. Some observers interpreted these words as a tragic sign of his inability to fully process what was happening. Others claimed that he was well aware of his guilt and simply resigned himself to the inevitable. For his last meal, Clayton requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, green beans, and a cola. This simple assortment of comfort foods stood in contrast to the intense debates unfolding around his mental state. To some, these details illustrate the raw humanity of a man awaiting death, even while larger arguments about morality and legality swirled around him. Case 2. Andrew Brannon. Andrew Brannon was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who faced a tragic end on Georgia's death row. In 1998, he encountered Deputy Kyle Dinkeller during a routine traffic stop. What should have been an ordinary procedure escalated into violence when Brannon opened fire on the deputy, killing him in a shocking confrontation captured on the patrol car's dashboard camera. His attorneys argued that Brannon's severe post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar disorder played a major role in this crime. They pointed to his military service, where he witnessed intense combat and suffered traumatic experiences. After returning home, he struggled with mental health issues that were never fully treated, leaving him vulnerable to violent outbursts and irrational thinking. Prosecutors, however, highlighted the brutality of the killing, stating that Deputy Dinkeller was shot multiple times in a manner that suggested Brannon acted with clear intent. During the trial, mental health experts testified that Brannon had serious psychological conditions. The question arose, did these conditions impair his ability to distinguish right from wrong? Georgia law allowed the jury to consider his mental problems, but in the end, they sentenced him to death. The family of Deputy Dinkeller expressed relief at the verdict, feeling that justice was served for their loved one's senseless murder. On the 13th day of January, 2015, Andrew Brannon was executed by lethal injection in Georgia. Before his final moments, he offered condolences to the family of Deputy Dinkeller and acknowledged the harm he had caused. In a final twist, he addressed his spiritual advisor, saying, "I'm glad to be getting out of this place. And Dick, you're in charge," hinting that he longed to escape the torment of his mental state. Brannon's last meal reflected a hearty breakfast taste: 3 eggs over easy, hash browns, biscuits and gravy, sausage, pecan waffles with strawberries, milk, apple juice, and decaf coffee. Observers noted that this meal seemed like a final return to simpler comforts, a departure from the grim reality of his circumstances. Some found it poignant that a former soldier's last request echoed the warmth of a traditional morning spread. Case 3. John Ferguson. John Ferguson was convicted of killing 8 people in Florida in 1977. His crimes shocked the region and led many to label him as one of the most dangerous men in state history. Yet behind the headlines lay a long-standing battle with paranoid schizophrenia. For decades, medical records described his delusional beliefs and extreme paranoia. He called himself the Prince of God, insisting that he had unique spiritual powers. During his trial, prosecutors stressed the brutality of his crimes. The victims were subjected to terror before Ferguson ultimately took their lives. Defense attorneys tried to draw attention to his extensive mental health history, hoping to convince the court that he was not fully aware of his actions. However, the jury decided that the severity of the murders outweighed any mitigating factors. They recommended a death sentence, which the court upheld. Over the years, Ferguson's lawyers continued to argue that his schizophrenia rendered him unable to comprehend his punishment. They presented medical evaluations showing he had active delusions, including the belief that he would be resurrected after execution. The state maintained that he was competent enough to face the consequences of his actions. Appeals courts sided with prosecutors, ruling that Ferguson understood the nature of the death penalty, at least on a basic level. On the 5th day of August 2013, John Ferguson was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Before the procedure began, he made a final statement reiterating that he was the Prince of God and would rise again. Observers described his tone as calm, yet filled with an eerie confidence in his delusions. This last declaration reinforced the argument that Ferguson was living in a world shaped by psychosis. In terms of his final meal, Ferguson declined any special request. Instead, he ate the standard prison dinner that evening, which reportedly included a meat and vegetable patty, white bread, stewed tomatoes, potato salad, carrots, and iced tea. Some viewed this decision as a sign that he did not engage in the usual rituals surrounding an execution. Others believed it was yet another reflection of his delusional state, indicating he expected to transcend the event entirely. Case 4. Gary Thomas Allen. Gary Thomas Allen's story is a tragic mix of mental illness, violence, and fatal consequences. In 1986, he shot and killed his estranged fiancée outside an Oklahoma daycare, leaving behind shock and grief among those who witnessed the event. Despite the obvious harm he caused, there was a deeper layer to Allen's situation, as he had a history of mental health problems that intensified after a police shootout left fragments of a bullet lodged in his brain. Over time, doctors diagnosed Allen with conditions such as psychosis, dementia, and schizophrenia. He often exhibited disorganized thinking and difficulty distinguishing fantasy from reality. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality of his crime and insisted that he knew exactly what he was doing when he pulled the trigger. Defense attorneys countered that Allen's mental deterioration severely limited his capacity to act rationally. The debate raged on in courts, with each side arguing its view of accountability versus compromised mental function. In the months before his execution, various advocacy groups tried to intervene, asserting that executing a man with significant brain damage and mental disorders was unwise and unethical. Appeals were filed, highlighting his inability to fully understand the consequences of his actions. Nevertheless, Oklahoma authorities held firm. They stated that Allen had been found competent through the existing legal processes and that the severity of his offense justified the ultimate punishment. His execution took place on the 6th day of November 2012. Coincidentally, it was election night across the country, and many people were focused on the presidential race. Allen's final words were rambling and confused, with him making references to election results, stating that Obama had won 2 out of 3 counties. Witnesses remarked that he appeared unaware of how inappropriate this topic was at that dire moment. Some speculated he was clinging to whatever mental footholds he could grasp as the lethal injection drew closer. His last meal request reflected a hearty appetite, a large meat lover's pizza, and a Pepsi. While unremarkable on the surface, this final detail highlighted the clear difference between everyday comfort foods and the harsh truth of state-sanctioned death. Observers noted that the pizza box and soda cup seemed oddly ordinary in a setting marked by extreme finality. Case 5. Robert Mormon. Robert Mormon's crime was both brutal and bewildering. While on a furlough from an Arizona prison in 1984, he murdered and dismembered his mother, shocking the community with the sheer horror of his actions. Police discovered the grisly scene, which left little doubt about his responsibility for the crime. Yet beneath the headlines lay a long history of intellectual disability and mental impairments that complicated discussions about his guilt and punishment. Mormon had borderline intellectual functioning, and those who knew him described him as a man with a childlike demeanor. Defense lawyers argued that his mental limitations meant he could not fully comprehend his actions or the legal proceedings that followed. Prosecutors, on the other hand, pointed to the details of the killing as proof that he understood enough to plan and execute a crime. The legal battles went on for years, and in the end, the state deemed him competent to face the death penalty. On the 29th day of February 2012, Robert Moorman was executed by lethal injection. In his final statement, he expressed deep remorse, saying he hoped the families could begin healing and forgive him in time. This apology struck some observers as sincere, while others believed it was too little, too late. Regardless, his contrition added a human dimension to a case often viewed purely through the lens of brutality. For his last meal, Moorman requested a substantial spread: a double hamburger with onion, lettuce, and tomato, French fries with ketchup, 2 beef burritos, 2 containers of Rocky Road ice cream, and 3 RC colas. Many viewed this as an unusually large order, symbolizing a final attempt to savor basic pleasures before facing the end. The prison granted his request, though some questioned whether such generosity should be extended to someone who committed such a shocking act. Critics of the execution argued that Moorman's intellectual disability made him an unsuitable candidate for the death penalty. They cited evolving standards of decency in the United States, pointing out that the Supreme Court had ruled against executing individuals with significant mental impairment. Yet Moorman's case was not deemed severe enough in that regard, and the state proceeded with the sentence. Supporters of the punishment contended that the vicious nature of his crime outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Case 6. Edwin Hart Turner. Edwin Hart Turner was convicted of a double murder that occurred during a gas station robbery in Mississippi in 1995. 2 men lost their lives, sparking outrage among the public and a demand for swift justice. Yet Turner's background was filled with episodes of severe mental illness, including bipolar disorder with psychotic features. He had attempted suicide in the past and was part of a family history riddled with tragedy, including multiple suicides. Prosecutors underscored the senseless violence of the killings. They painted a picture of a man who acted with a cold disregard for human life, shooting people who posed no threat to him. However, defense teams countered that Turner's mental state was dangerously unstable, leading him to behave in ways he might not have if he were mentally sound. Over time, the courts concluded that, despite his condition, he understood enough about his actions to be held responsible. Before his execution, advocates for the mentally ill petitioned for clemency, emphasizing that a life sentence would be more appropriate given his psychiatric diagnosis. They argued that Turner's capacity to control his impulses was severely impaired and that the justice system should not impose the death penalty on someone in such dire need of psychological intervention. Nevertheless, Mississippi officials proceeded with their plan, believing that the severity of his crime demanded the ultimate punishment. On the 8th day of February 2012, Edwin Hart Turner was executed by lethal injection. As he lay strapped to the gurney, witnesses noted that he declined to make any final statement. At one point, he simply asked, "What are we waiting on?" suggesting a resigned acceptance of his fate. This lack of a dramatic concluding speech left observers to wonder about his mindset in those final moments. He requested a porterhouse steak cooked medium rare, fried shrimp with cocktail sauce, 2 slices of Texas toast, a side salad with Russian dressing, a package of Twizzlers candy, and sweet tea as a last meal. The elaborate menu revealed a taste for comfort foods that might remind him of simpler times. Onlookers could only guess whether this final indulgence offered any solace during his last hours. Case 7. Frank Spisak. Frank Spisak was a self-proclaimed neo-Nazi who committed a series of shootings at Cleveland State University in 1982, leaving 3 people dead and others wounded. His actions were motivated by hate, as he made no secret of his admiration for extremist ideologies. During his trial, prosecutors highlighted his violent rhetoric, swastika tattoos, and chilling confessions. Yet underneath his hateful persona, mental health experts diagnosed Spisak with severe delusional and personality disorders. Throughout his legal proceedings, Spisak's defense sought to show that his disordered thinking played a significant part in the killings. They pointed to episodes of paranoid thought and grandiose fantasies that fueled his animosity toward those he deemed inferior. However, the jury saw a cold-blooded murderer who planned and executed acts of violence based on bigotry. They recommended the death penalty, and the court agreed. Over the years, Spisak appealed on various grounds, including claims that his mental illness was not fully taken into account. He contended that he was consumed by irrational beliefs and a twisted worldview, leaving him unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. Courts, though, consistently ruled that his self-awareness and explicit targeting of victims showed enough comprehension to warrant capital punishment. On the 17th day of February, 2011, Frank Spisak was executed by lethal injection in Ohio. His final words were strikingly religious, despite his history of hateful rhetoric. Speaking in German, he recited several verses from the Book of Revelation, invoking images of judgment and the end of days. Observers were taken aback by the contrast between his earlier neo-Nazi declarations and his final biblical references. For his last meal, Spisak requested spaghetti with light tomato sauce, a salad with Italian dressing, and chocolate cake. This relatively modest selection stood in stark contrast to his extreme beliefs and the violent acts he committed. Some speculated that this simple meal might have been his way of embracing a final moment of normalcy, while others saw it as irrelevant in light of his deeply troubling actions. Critics of Spisak's execution argued that his mental disorders blurred the line between a calculated hate crime and a delusional rampage. They maintained that the death penalty did not address the underlying issues that fueled his deadly outbursts. Meanwhile, supporters insisted that society must firmly punish those who murder in the name of hate, regardless of any psychological disorders they might have. Case 8. Cal Coburn Brown. Cal Coburn Brown was convicted of the torture murder of Holly Washa in Washington in 1991. This crime involved kidnapping, assault, and a prolonged period of abuse before Washa was ultimately killed. Prosecutors described the incident as especially cruel and methodical, arguing that Brown showed clear intent in planning and carrying out each step. Yet Brown's defense team insisted that his bipolar disorder severely impaired his judgment, rendering him unable to fully control his impulses or appreciate the enormity of his actions. Throughout his trial and appeals, Brown maintained that he should not be put to death because of his mental health condition. He claimed that without proper medication, his moods and behaviors became wildly unpredictable. Defense attorneys presented medical records showing that he had been diagnosed long before the crime and had struggled to stay on a consistent treatment plan. Despite these arguments, jurors concluded that he bore enough responsibility to merit a death sentence. The execution took place on the 10th day of September, 2010. Brown's final words revealed his frustration with what he saw as unfair sentencing disparities. He pointed out that people who killed multiple victims sometimes received life sentences, while he faced death for a single killing. He did not apologize to the victim's family, instead focusing on his belief that the system lacked true consistency. Observers noted that his tone reflected bitterness rather than regret. When it came to his last meal, Brown requested a combination of meat pizza, apple pie, coffee, and milk. This selection might have seemed ordinary, but it became yet another point of contrast between mundane daily choices and the gravity of an execution. The pizza box was a stark sight in a room that soon would host the administration of lethal drugs, highlighting the dissonance between a casual preference and a catastrophic end. Case 9. Jack Harrison Trawick. Jack Harrison Trawick was a troubled man from Alabama whose life ended in a death that left a heavy mark on those who followed his story. Trawick was convicted for the kidnapping and murder of a young woman named Stephanie Gach, who was 21 years old at the time of her tragic death in 1992. His crime shocked the community and sparked long debates about the treatment of mentally ill offenders on death row. From an early age, Trawick struggled with serious mental health issues. Medical records indicate that he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as early as 1970. This illness made it difficult for him to distinguish between reality and delusion. Over the years, he experienced many violent episodes and had a long history of institutionalization as he battled uncontrollable impulses. Despite various attempts at treatment, his condition worsened, leading him down a path marked by fear, anger, and dangerous behavior. During his trial, Trawick's defense lawyers argued that his chronic battle with schizophrenia impaired his ability to fully understand the consequences of his actions. They stressed that his mental illness had always been a heavy burden, one that left him confused and unable to think clearly during critical moments. Although they presented evidence of his long-term struggles, the court ruled that Trawick was responsible for the crime he committed. The jury, despite considering his mental condition, sentenced him to death, a decision that continues to be a subject of controversy and debate. On the 11th day of June, 2009, Jack Harrison Trawick was executed by lethal injection in Alabama. Witnesses noted that in his final moments, he offered a brief and soft apology for his actions. His final words were not dramatic, but they carried the quiet weight of a man who had long been at war with his mind. At that moment, Trawick's words reflected a deep-seated regret and an acknowledgement of the consequences his long struggle with mental illness had wrought. Trawick requested fried chicken, French fries, onion soup, and a roll. This modest meal, filled with familiar comfort foods, seemed to provide him with a final taste of normalcy, a small echo of a life he might once have known before his troubles overtook him. Though he had spent many years in institutions and on death row, his request for a simple meal emphasized a basic human desire for comfort in the face of an inevitable end. Case 10. Kelsey Patterson. Kelsey Patterson was an inmate in Texas whose life ended amid controversy and deep questions about mental illness and responsibility. In 1992, he fatally shot 2 people without a clear motive. The crime shocked the community, not only because of its brutal nature, but also due to the mystery surrounding his state of mind. Authorities later learned that Patterson was suffering from a serious mental illness that clouded his judgment and distorted his perception of reality. Medical evaluations revealed that Patterson was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He believed that electronic devices were secretly implanted in his body, a delusion that led him to feel constantly watched and tormented. This distorted belief system, combined with his confusion and fear, played a significant role in the events that led to the killings. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his mental struggles, the legal system held him fully responsible for his actions. His case became a flashpoint for debates on whether individuals with such severe psychiatric disorders should face the death penalty. During his trial, Patterson's defense team worked hard to show that his mental condition made him less aware of the consequences of his actions. They pointed out that his delusions were so powerful that they undermined his ability to tell right from wrong. Even though his lawyers presented evidence of his condition and the challenges he faced daily, the jury ultimately convicted him. In a rare move, even though Texas's parole board had recommended clemency due to his documented insanity, the governor chose not to grant relief. This decision added another layer of controversy to a case already marked by deep moral and legal questions. On the 18th day of May, 2004, Kelsey Patterson was executed by lethal injection in Texas. His final moments were marked by a stream of incoherent and delusional statements. Witnesses recalled that his last words included phrases such as, "Statement to what? I'm not guilty of the charge of capital murder. Give me my life back. Go to hell." These words, spoken in a rapid and confused manner, reflected a mind still trapped in its delusions even as death approached. Patterson made an unusual choice for his last meal. He declined to request a formal, multi-item meal and instead accepted a simple candy bar and a soft drink. While this might seem like a minor detail, many observers noted that his modest last meal was in keeping with the overall picture of a man whose mental illness had stripped away the normal desires and rituals that others might have embraced in their final hours. We have now explored 10 harrowing cases of mentally ill inmates who were executed in the United States. Each story reveals how mental disorders can shape crimes, trials, and final moments. Does the death penalty offer justice when severe mental illness is involved, or does it raise deeper moral dilemmas? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel, and like this video. Thank you for joining us for this crucial discussion.